Hi guys, welcome back to Father and Son Investing. We're going to talk about I-bonds again, but today, this video, we're going to talk about some of the disadvantages of I-bonds. I-bonds right now are a really hot commodity, so much that the website actually crashed recently because so many people were trying to buy them. Why is everybody buying I-bonds? Because of the interest rate it's paying. The annualized interest rate is 9.62%. That is absolutely amazing. Why is it that high? Well, because inflation is that high. I-bonds, if you're not familiar with them, are indexed to the inflation rate. So an I-bond has two components of the interest rate that it pays. There is the base rate, which actually right now is 0%. And then there is the indexed for inflation rate, which is done by the consumer price index that everybody is familiar with. Add those two together, and right now you get 9.62% annualized. So in the last video, I talked about some of the advantages of I-bonds. If you haven't watched that video yet, there will be a link to it at the end of this video. In this video, we're going to talk about some of the disadvantages of I-bonds, what might make you think twice about purchasing I-bonds. Now, first on my list is going to be the interest rate. Now, that may sound funny because right now the interest rate is fantastic, 9.62%, but it hasn't been that high until just recently. In fact, let's just take a look at some of this from the treasurydirect.gov website. I was explaining earlier that the base rate is 0%, and it's been that way for quite a while. We have to go back to 2019 where we see that they were paying any sort of a base rate, and that was only 0.2%. Then we'll just go down a little bit farther and we'll see what the inflation rate is. Of course, 4.81%. We're going to make that annualized by doubling it because this is for 6 months. So we double that, we get 9.62%. But if we go back just into November of 2020, the base rate was just 0.84%. So take that 0% plus 0.84%, and the I-bonds were only paying 0.84% per 6 months. So if you annualize that, 1.68%. So going back to what I said was the first disadvantage is the interest rate. It's super high right now, but I don't think we can expect it to be that high all of the time. You may be thinking, well, inflation is here to stay, but that's why the Fed is raising interest rates so high, is to knock inflation down. When that inflation rate finally comes down, guess what? The I-bond rate is going to come back down as well. It might not go all the way down to the 0.8%, 1.6% annualized, but certainly in the 2 to 3% range would not be unexpected. In fact, that's really the Fed's goal, is to have inflation running at 2 to 3%. So one has to ask themselves, is 2 to 3% interest on my money good enough? All that is doing is just keeping up with inflation. It's not actually increasing your purchasing power. You're just sort of maintaining your purchasing power. Now that leads me to disadvantage number 2. I said you're maintaining your purchasing power, but really you might not be, because if you're not familiar with this, the I-bonds are subject to United States federal tax. They're not subject to state and local government tax, but they are subject to federal taxes. And depending on how much you do or don't make, you may be paying a significant amount of tax on those bonds when you finally do redeem them. Now that's going to lead me to disadvantage number 3, and that has to do with taxes should you want to use these I-bonds for education purposes. While the interest from I-bonds can be excluded from federal taxes for education purposes, there are some strict criteria, and you need to make sure that you're meeting all of them. Number 1, you have to cash in your qualified savings bond in the same tax year that you're claiming the exclusion for education purposes. Number 2, you have to have paid qualified higher education expenses in that same tax year for yourself, your spouse, or your dependents. So you need to keep track of those two, especially I think the paying part, because it's easy to actually pay for tuition perhaps ahead of time and then thinking, oh, this is for next year's tuition. You hold off on your bond until the following year, and now you've got things paid in one year and redeemed in another. You need to make sure that you fit the filing status. It's really anything other than married filing separately. You have to make sure that your adjusted gross income is not too high. What is too high? Well, this comes from the IRS Form 8815, which is the exclusion of interest from Series I bonds. And we come down here to line 9. If your adjusted gross income is more than $98,200, single or head of household or widow or widower, or $154,800 if you are married filing jointly. You can forget being able to exclude your interest on these bonds for the purposes of higher education. Now here is one more very, very important thing to understand. It says here, note, a bond bought by a parent and issued in the name of his or her child under age 24 does not qualify for the exclusion by the parent or the child. These bonds have to be issued to a person who is older than 24 years old when they are issued, not when they are redeemed, when they are issued. Of course, when they're redeemed, you'd still be over 24 anyway. So keep this in mind. If you purchase that bond for a child who is under 24 years of age when you purchase it, they certainly can use it for higher education expenses when they go to redeem it, but depending on what their tax bracket is, they may be paying some taxes. That's going to lead me to my next disadvantage for I-bonds, and that has to do with the way that the interest is paid. Now, with these bonds, you can purchase them for as cheap as $25. That $25 then would earn interest each month. Every 6 months, the interest is then compounded and put onto the value of the bond so that that compounded interest can start to earn interest more. So it's not a monthly compound interest, it's a biannually compound interest. You don't actually receive the interest until you redeem the bond, which is not a big deal for a lot of people, but if you are retired and you're trying to buy these bonds so that you will have retirement income, that can be a little difficult, especially if you've purchased, say, a $10,000 bond and you don't necessarily want to redeem all $10,000 at once. How do you get around that? You can just buy multiple smaller bonds. In fact, people talk about having a bond ladder, which is another video. So just keep that in mind if you're thinking of purchasing this as a funding your retirement. Just know that you don't actually get the interest payment until you redeem the bond. All right, what's my last disadvantage for this video? You can't actually have this within a non-taxable account. You can't stick it in a Roth IRA. You can't purchase them in your 401k. These bonds have to be purchased within a taxable account. And really, you just purchase them at the treasury.gov, where you then have your own account with them. All right, that's it for my disadvantages for the U.S. Treasury I-bonds. The interest rate, while it's fantastic now, good chance it's going back down, and one has to decide if 2 or 3% is good enough, really just maintaining your purchasing power. Remember that they're taxable. Remember that there are some strict limitations there on education purposes. Remember that if you're looking at these for retirement, that you don't actually get the interest until you redeem the bond. So an older person might not want to purchase these in large denominations. Remember, you can purchase them as small as $25. And then remember that you just can't put these within a Roth IRA or some other non-taxable account. You're going to do it at your treasury.gov account. There may be some other disadvantages. If you have some that you'd like to share, please feel free to leave those in the comments. Otherwise, if this was helpful, please give us a thumbs up. And as always, until next time, enjoy your investing.